25-mile-an-hour into Glasgow Express was derailed as it was leaving the Linslade Tunnel. The locomotive then hit the side of a bridge, crushing the cab. The driver, Mr. William Plummer of Barking in East London, died instantly. A second driver in the cab and one passenger were injured, but the other 120 passengers escaped unhurt. 10 of the 12 carriages were derailed, but they remained upright, preventing many more casualties. The accident was caused by an obstruction on the line, a 20-foot length of new rail which was spread in several bits over the track as a result of the derailment. Investigators confirmed the rail had become dislodged from a freight wagon delivering it from the manufacturers to London. The rail hit the tunnel side and fell off when the freight train passed by half an hour ahead of the express. After the locomotive left the track, it smashed into a bridge 50 yards away and came to rest several hundred yards up the line. A quarter-of-a-mile stretch of damaged track has to be repaired. Full services aren't expected to be restored till Sunday.
The plumber was already dead when his 12-coach train ground to a halt. The overnight express was travelling at 75 miles an hour when it left the rails. A split second later, it smashed into a bridge, but careered on, tearing up the track. Pieces of rail had fallen from a goods train half an hour earlier and lain across the track near the tunnel exit. All but one of the coaches on the Glasgow Express were derailed. Amazingly, they all stayed upright.
There was a terrible sort of braking and shuddering, and you could feel the bottom of the train going against the stones.
Yeah, I thought it was going to fuck because the cars went right over. They come back up again.
Everyone around me was all frightened and they were really white and I was really worried and I thought, what else has happened here?
The bridge that killed driver Plummer almost certainly saved the lives of many of his passengers. Experts at the scene believe the train was veering violently to the right when the bridge bounced it back, off the rails but on course. Had it been unchecked, the train would have ended up in a canal, 40 feet below and down a steep embankment. It had been a frightening end to a day trip to France for a party of Northampton school children who were among the 120 passengers. For them all, it was an incredible escape.
Waterloo to Bournemouth intercity train had been travelling at 90 miles an hour when it hit the branches of two trees, blown onto the line by a short-lived but violent storm. The window of the driver's cab was smashed and the front coach immediately derailed. The second and third coaches also came off the line as the whole train hurtled half a mile before stopping. Ploughing through the track and sleepers as it went, the conductor rail twisted back on itself.
It was sat there quite heavily, and suddenly, which would break, it was like sparkles around it, and a dreadful noise, and we thought that we were for it. Literally, it was very frightening indeed, terribly frightening.
Two other trains hit trees on the line nearby, but without mishap. This morning, the 10,000 commuters who use the Bournemouth to Waterloo line were facing delays of half an hour on their journeys because of diversions around the derailment.
My Waterloo to Bournemouth Express was approaching Eltham Bridge just south of Fleet at speeds of up to 90 miles an hour when it collided with a fir tree which had been felled by a freak whirlwind during last night's gales. The first three carriages were derailed but ploughed on down the track for a further half a mile, ripping up conductor rails and sleepers in the process. Last night's accident was the most serious on the South Coast line for many years, but it could so easily have been worse. British rail engineers say they have the train's automatic coupling system to thank for keeping the carriages upright after the derailment. 20 of the passengers were treated for shock, but no one was seriously hurt. The only real casualty was the 62-year-old driver Pat Kernam from Bournemouth, who suffered minor cuts and bruises when a branch of the tree pierced his cabin window, but he was allowed home after treatment.
Mr. Kernan, British Rail say you're a hero today. It was your cool-headedness, they say, that saved the lives of the passengers.
No, I've done no more than any other driver would have done in that situation. The only thing you can do, make emergency application of the brakes, and then it's out of your hands. If you're off the road, you're off the road, and you can't do nothing about it. You go where the train takes you.
Glasgow and Edinburgh came off the rails outside the town of Pitlochry.
British Rail investigators say it could take them weeks to find out what caused the accident. The overnight express had just left Pitlochry and was travelling at less than 50 miles an hour. Rescuers say had it been going faster, many people would have been killed. 3 of the express carriages finished up on the roof at the bottom of a steep embankment. 2 others rolled down the other side, and only 3 stopped them from crashing onto a road. British Rail officials say they're astonished at the extent of the damage. More than a quarter of a mile of the track was destroyed. When ambulance men arrived at the scene at first, they thought there had been a major disaster. and they expected to find a large number of passengers seriously injured. It was only after the final search at daylight that people started to realise just how fortunate they were to escape with little more than cuts and bruises.
I think it was a miracle. Nobody was hurt or killed. When we started to tilt over, I thought something was bound to happen to me. I was bound to get injured, but I'm very lucky. I'm very thankful to be in one piece.
Those who escaped injury were taken to a nearby hotel, and policemen have spent most of the day interviewing them as part of the official inquiry. The most graphic account was from the train driver, who says that when he realised something was wrong, he stopped the train and looked back. Most of the carriages had simply disappeared.
All services in London's Paddington station have been suspended after the Penzance to London overnight train came off the rails as it was entering Paddington earlier today. 3 people received minor injuries and they've now left hospital. Intercity services between the West Country and Paddington have had to stop short at Reading and Slough. Ralph Smith reporting.
The scale of the damage has amazed British Rail and caused havoc for the 48,000 people who use Paddington every day. It's the first time in more than 10 years that the station has been closed by an accident. For a while, a postal worker was feared trapped in the wreckage, but the casualties involved only 3 of the few dozen passengers who were just stirring from their sleeping compartments as the train pulled into Paddington 5 minutes late. A signal and 3 other tracks were damaged as the locomotive jumped the rails after crossing points and derailed 11 of the 12 coaches behind it. Rush hour commuters found local services cancelled, and Western Region intercity passengers had to switch to suburban trains at Reading, Slough and Ealing Broadway. How soon things return to normal will depend on how quickly salvage teams can remove carriages weighing more than 40 tons apiece and a 117 tons locomotive. That will need a special crane brought from Bristol.
British Rail said it was lucky that no one was killed. The train hit a platform while some of the passengers were still asleep. Some of them went to hospital with slight cuts and bruises, and most of the 13 carriages stayed upright, which is why there were so few injuries. And a warning, trains in and out of Paddington may not be back to normal until late.
The Express sleeper crashed at Linslade, north of Leighton Buzzard, because a 60-foot length of rail had been improperly loaded and shunted 110 miles away at Towton. In the early hours of December the 9th, 1982, the Express ploughed into the rail, which was straddling the line. The driver, 46-year-old William Plummer, died when his cab was crushed against the entrance to a tunnel. The accident inspector's report blamed the improper shunting at Towton. The rail had shifted after the flat wagon carrying the rails had been shunted over a hump. The rail fell from the southbound freight train after catching the tunnel entrance. The report said it was reprehensible that the men's irresponsible actions had been condoned by supervisors. British Rail say they launched an inquiry immediately after the accident. They accepted the rail hadn't been secured in the proper way and that the wagon had wrongly been uncoupled for shunting. Staff had been disciplined where appropriate, and all departments reminded of correct shunting procedures. British Rail refused to say exactly what form the disciplinary action took. That was a matter between management and staff, but they did admit that no one had been sacked. Meanwhile, representatives of the railmen's and the supervisors' unions are urgently scrutinising the accident report.
The Liverpool to Glasgow train was split into 2, 3 miles south of Carlisle. The front section went on to the station, and to stop a pile-up, the rear section was diverted to a goods line, but it ploughed through a bridge and into a river. Public inquiry is to be held into the derailment at Northumberland yesterday. The train left the track on a bend, and 7 carriages overturned. There were only minor injuries. British Rail investigators are waiting to question the driver, who's still in hospital.
Cameras have transformed the scene of yesterday's near disaster. Only the huge engine of the overnight express now lies beside the track. 200 tons of rubble and 500 tons of damaged coaches have been lifted from the scene overnight. Away from the track in adjoining gardens, the sleeper coaches, from which 78 people emerged almost unscathed, lie decently shrouded. The driver, who's recovering in hospital, is still to be questioned about the speed his train was travelling on this 50-mile-an-hour bend. But the way the coaches withstood the impact is a source of satisfaction to railway authorities. This is the 3rd major accident at the spot, Others have claimed a total of 11 lives.
The Aberdeen to King's Cross overnight express, which crashed, was probably going too fast. That's according to the Transport Minister, Mr. David Mitchell. His statement to the Commons caused a row. Backbenchers said it was outrageous and scandalous and he should withdraw it. But Mr. Mitchell said his advice was correct, although investigations were still going on.
The Train Drivers Union, ASLEF, is calling on the Transport Under-Secretary, David Mitchell, to withdraw his remarks concerning the Morpeth train crash. Mr. Mitchell told MPs yesterday that excessive speed was the likely cause of Sunday's derailment. ASLEF General Secretary Ray Buckton accused Mr. Mitchell of jumping the gun and said it was outrageous that he should comment before a proper inquiry had taken place. At the scene of the crash in Northumberland, repair work is underway. The first train to use the line since the accident is expected this afternoon. Alan Powell reports.
British Rail brought in 2 of their heaviest cranes to lift the 120-ton locomotive. Workmen had tunnelled underneath the toppled engine to get lifting slings around it. Slowly, the wrecked giant, a Class 47 with 2,500 horsepower, was pulled upright. The track where Sunday's near disaster occurred has now been completely cleared and relaid. British Rail say mainline services will be running again through Morpeth later today, but with strict speed limits. At the same time, workmen have begun the task of cutting up the 3 remaining sleeper coaches which plunged
the scene from Stirling, Falkirk and other towns. Polmont, between Falkirk and Lindisco, was the scene last year of a serious accident in which 3 railway workers were killed. First reports indicated that 5 people were killed tonight in the crash, half a mile west of Polmont station. But it's now feared that the death toll may be much higher, perhaps 10 or 12, and that 100 people have been injured. A fleet of ambulances is taking the injured to hospital, and at least 7 fire engines are on the scene, their crews helping to cut people free from the wreckage. The police have appealed for the public not to visit the scene, but to allow emergency services free access.
Railway investigators have begun inquiries into whether a cow on the line could have caused the train crash near Falkirk, which cost 13 lives. They want to know how the animal could have strayed onto what's normally fenced-off track.
Salvage crews have been working for nearly 24 hours to clear the wreckage of Britain's worst rail disaster for 17 years. Painstaking investigations will be carried out into the cause, but the only apparent explanation is that with his train travelling at anything up to 100 miles an hour, the driver braked hard to try to avoid a cow on the line, and the coaches were derailed. The driver, who has severe head injuries, was at the controls in the leading coach, with the train being pushed by the power unit at the rear. An even greater tragedy was only narrowly avoided. A train coming in the opposite direction was a few minutes late, giving its driver just enough time to see what had happened and pull up. 26 people are still in hospital, and today one of the injured spoke about the crash.
The train started to shudder, and first I thought we were going to hit something, so I started to brace myself. And then the carriage started swaying from side to side. I could hear gravel, and I thought maybe we'd hit some dirt or something. And the next thing, I was thrown across the carriage and the window.
Of a cow were found, and it's thought the train hit it. The driver of another train, which passed the scene just before, reported seeing the cow.
26 people have been treated in hospital after a train derailment in Tyne and Wear. A 125 high-speed train travelling from Leeds to Edinburgh came off the rails at Birtley. It was the 3rd derailment in 5 weeks and came less than 40 hours after the accident at Polmont, which killed 13 people. The coaches in today's derailment were Mark III types, designed to protect passengers in a crash. Tony Baker has been to the scene.
According to British Rail engineers, it was certainly the Mark III which saved lives at Birtley today. The Intercity Express was passing a chemical works when the 2 middle coaches jackknifed into the air before plunging down an embankment. But these are what BR calls its cocoon carriages, specially strengthened with a steel shell, anti-crumpling bars and double-glazed windows. 26 people were taken to hospital, but all but 3 were out by this afternoon, and those who've been kept in aren't said to be seriously injured. Most of the 200 on board walked away from the crash to drink tea in the yard of the chemical works, and...
But it was starting to slow down, and we felt this bump, and it had jumped the rails. There was dirt flying up by the side of the window, and then it started to sway around, and people started to scream and obviously feel a bit frightened. And then eventually it slewed over on its side.
Well, it will be subject to a full domestic inquiry, and no doubt later to a Department of Transport inquiry, which I have no doubt will be in public.
Are there any similarities, can you say yet, between this crash and the previous crashes at Morpeth and in Scotland?
I can't. There's no indication at all of the cause.
Investigations have already started into the cause of the crash, and one possibility is being checked. That is that the hot sun caused the rails to expand and made the centre of the train leap from the track.
Despite the 3 recent train crashes, British Rail insists its overall safety record is good, both for trains with and without Mark III coaches. Emergency teams here were relieved injuries weren't more serious, and some commuters could carry on almost as normal.
One passenger said it felt as if they'd hit something. Some of the injured were taken to hospital for treatment, the rest were given first aid by the track. Services between Birmingham and Paddington were badly disrupted.
British Rail inquiry will start tomorrow into yesterday's train derailment at Dorridge in Solihull, in which 30 people were injured. No one was seriously hurt, and passengers have described their escape as a miracle. British Rail won't know what caused the accident until after their inquiry, but they've confirmed that one theory being investigated is that the train was travelling too fast over a junction with a speed limit of just 20 miles an hour.
6 people died and 18 were injured when a packed commuter train crashed into a freight train at Wembley Central in London tonight. Hundreds more commuters escaped unharmed. The 5:54 from Euston to Bletchley hit the side of the freight train, which was travelling from Willesden to Holyhead. Some of the coaches toppled on their sides, and many of the passengers got out by climbing through the windows.
In the nighttime chaos, it's been impossible to piece together what did go wrong. But British Rail and eyewitnesses confirmed that 10 minutes after the 5:54 Euston to Bletchley passenger train set off, it smashed into the was to have veered the main line outside Wembley station. The passenger train, which is approaching top speed, buckled and the first 2 carriages toppled over, slewing debris across nearby express lines. Rescuers are still searching for anyone who might be trapped. Meanwhile, survivors have been describing what happened.
I was riding in the rear coach of the 1754 train out of Euston. We were travelling at about 75 miles an hour, the normal speed, when suddenly the driver applied the brakes in emergency. A few moments later, perhaps 3 or 4 seconds, the coach surged almost to slowed right down, and I knew that we had hit something or come off the rails. The coach shuddered to a halt fairly quickly, and as it did so, we came into contact with a freight train alongside, which ground along the side of our coach. As soon as the coach stopped, I looked out of the window and discovered the front part of the train had fallen over onto the fast tracks out of Euston. This presented extreme danger because at this time of the evening, those fast tracks are used by 100-mile-an-hour expresses, which pass every 5 or 6 minutes. And there was great danger that such a train would collide into ours. My first thought, therefore, was to try and stop those trains. I went to the rear driving cab and got the device called a track circuit clip and put that down on the track to put the signals to danger. I then ran to the nearest signal and telephoned the signal box and told them what had happened.
I think it was a freight train with container trucks or whatever, and it just like smacked into the side. I was like, saw the freight train hitting us, and all of a sudden the carriage I was in went over sideways, and it's like, you know, it's careering along sideways, and it came to a stop, and there was smoke and everything everywhere. People started screaming, and people were just getting up and trying to get out.
What happened to you? Were you hurt?
Well, I mean, I was like smashed against the window, and there was a guy underneath me who like went out from underneath. He was going out the window, and I was like trying to hold him, stop him going out, but he just went.
Were many people hurt?
Well, I think there were definitely 2 guys dead.
Dozens of injured commuters were ferried to the nearby Central Middlesex Hospital, though most were suffering from superficial injuries and shock. Nevertheless, casualty staff are on standby tonight in case anyone else is found at the scene of the crash.
All night, salvage teams were working at the scene of the crash. Their first grim task to free 2 people still trapped in the wreckage. Firemen used welding equipment, oxyacetylene cutting gear and hydraulic jacks to get the front passenger carriages lifted upright. By 2 o'clock this morning, the 2 bodies had been recovered. Later, the section of the freight train still intact was moved further up the line. As dawn broke, the extent of the damage became clear. The entire section of the track had been blocked. 8 passenger train carriages and 5 freight containers had been derailed. The passenger train lay zigzagged along the track, every door flung wide open. A front carriage still straddled the line. British Rail has begun its own inquiry into what happened. Today, experts were examining overhead and trackside signalling and checking the passenger train driver's cab for possible faults. The passenger train was not due to stop at Wembley Central, and one theory is that the driver of that train failed to stop at a red light.
The train apparently passed through 2 yellow caution signals and a red stop signal and hit the Freightliner whilst it was straddling the points. Engineers say there's unlikely to have been a signal failure because this line is equipped with the most modern signalling equipment. They are investigating the possibility of driver error.
The inquiry's findings will be sent to the Department of Transport, which will decide whether or not to hold a full independent investigation. The accident has brought major disruption to rail travellers. Only inner suburban services between Euston and Watford are running normally. British Rail say the debris will not be cleared until tomorrow. Joan Thurkettle, News at 1, Wembley.
From Paddington was travelling at 50 miles an hour when it ran into a landslide washed onto the track by last night's torrential rain. Local services and mainline commuter trains were diverted via Barry. British Rail say delays and cancellations are likely to continue tomorrow.
To be an inquiry after a train was derailed at Stoulton in Worcestershire. 6 passengers were slightly hurt. With the details, Alan Jones.
The 705 from Hereford to London Paddington was travelling along a straight stretch of track at over 80 miles an hour when the back 4 carriages suddenly broke free. They immediately rolled off the track, one hitting a bridge and another ricocheting along the embankment. The automatic braking system came into action and only 6 of the 150 passengers on board were slightly injured. The damaged bridge sustained serious cracks and engineers will now have to decide whether it will have to be dismantled. Altogether, 7 of the 10 carriages came off the line and the 2 halves of the train finally came to rest almost a mile apart, causing extensive damage to the track. Railway officials carried out an immediate on-the-spot inquiry and were checking whether one of the plates joining sections of the track together could have been faulty.
At home, a passenger express crowded with Christmas shoppers hit an oil tanker train in Salford today. 2 people were killed and 77 were injured. A huge fireball engulfed the area. The tanker train left the Ellesmere port area for Leeds at 9 this morning. The express left Liverpool an hour later. They collided just before 11. The 2 trains were on the same line near Weast, right alongside the M602 motorway spur. The express ploughed into the back of the tanker train, which exploded on fire.
There were 300 people on the passenger train travelling from Liverpool to Scarborough on a stretch of single eastbound track. The freight train was travelling on the same track in the same direction. The passenger train crashed into the last tanker of the freight train, and that tanker and the tanker in front of it exploded and burned. The freight train was pulling 14 tankers, each one carrying 50 tons of highly inflammable oil. There is some suggestion that the rear 2 tankers had become detached from the freight train. If that was the case, it undoubtedly prevented a major catastrophe. If more tankers had blown up, people in their houses immediately alongside would have caught the full force. As it was, there was still a danger of the heat igniting other tankers, and firemen pumped 500 gallons of foam onto the fire to damp it down and stop it spreading.
confusion, really. Everybody was just trying to get out, really, you know.
There wasn't much panic. It was just nobody knew what was happening, obviously. And then, you know, we all just tried to get off as quick as we could.
We just heard a big bang, and we were thrown across the carriage. And after that, the train just kept on going along. Heard more bangs until it came to a stop.
The line on which the crash happened is controlled by signals. A train passing the signal automatically turns it to red, and it is designed to stop a following train automatically if it passes on red. But the driver can override this. An investigation will try to determine what happened, and this is not the only crash it will look at. Only yesterday, and just a few miles from here, another passenger train, empty this time, collided with a goods train. In that crash, a guard was killed and a driver injured. John Souchet, ITN, in Manchester.
Flames engulfed the cab of the Intercity Express, which was locked together with the rear of the tanker train that had been carrying 140,000 gallons of petroleum mixture. 3 of the tanks were ruptured in the crash. Passengers on the Intercity train fled up the embankment or onto the nearby motorway as burning petroleum was sprayed onto the 8 coaches of the express. Most of the casualties were in the first 2 coaches. They were incinerated as a fireball swept through them. One of the tankers was still leaking as firemen fought to control the blaze. 77 people were taken to hospital. 2 are said to be in a serious condition. All but 9 have now been allowed home after treatment. 32 fire engines with 150 men were sent to the scene. The first was there in minutes. With them went 30 ambulances. 200 houses were evacuated as firemen feared more explosions, and nearly 400 people were taken to a social club for safety. There were several minor crashes on the motorway that runs alongside the track as drivers swerved to avoid burning debris. The motorway will remain closed for 2 days. Firemen pumped foam onto one of the ruptured tanker wagons as other fire officers tried to reach the driver of the express, who was trapped in the wreckage of his cab. The charred remains of the first 2 carriages were also sifted in a search for bodies or any passengers who might have been buried under the tangle of metal. Danny Hughes was one of the injured who was taken to Hope Hospital, Salford. His girlfriend, Anne-Marie, told Chris Lowe what she remembered of the crash.
Just flames and smoke and being thrown from across the chair, across the table, onto the floor, and then just panic, really. Trying to get out of the train, trying to open the door, I couldn't open it. So Danny opened the door for us. Somebody had tried to open the door, but they couldn't get it open. Then jumping from the train onto the coals, which were on fire, and just scrambling, really, out of the way, because there was something dripping from under the train, and we thought it was petrol. And Danny was expecting an explosion, so we just moved quick out of the way.
It's believed the driver of the tanker train had been about to move off as the Intercity Express smashed into the rear. British Rail say they're satisfied the chemicals in the 14 tankers were being transported safely.
British Rail have already begun their own inquiry into the crash, and the Transport Secretary, Nicholas Ridley, will be making a statement about it in the House of Commons later this evening. The past year will go down as the worst year for crashes on Britain's national railway network for almost 20 years. Today's crash is the 6th serious accident since June and brings the total number of deaths this year to 18. In June, the Aberdeen to London sleeper left the rails near Morpeth. 38 people were hurt. The driver has been charged over the accident. A month later, a train between Glasgow and Edinburgh was derailed at Polmont after hitting a stray cow. 13 people were killed. 2 days later, an express was derailed near Newcastle upon Tyne. There were no serious injuries, and the crash was blamed on a faulty piece of track. On October the 1st, there was a derailment in the West Midlands. 30 people were hurt. 11 days later, a rush hour train hit a goods train at Wembley station in London. 3 people were killed. A report on that accident is with the Director of Public Prosecutions. British Rail said tonight that the number of deaths had to be seen in the context of the 695 million passengers they carry each year. A spokesman said, "Our safety record is second to none."
An explosion on a goods train carrying fuel has caused a huge...
British Rail have already begun their own inquiry into the crash, and the Transport Secretary, Nicholas Ridley, will be making a statement about it in the House of Commons later this evening. The past year will go down as the worst year for crashes on Britain's national railway network for almost 20 years. Today's crash is the 6th serious accident since June and brings the total number of deaths this year to 18. In June, the Aberdeen to London sleeper left the rails near Morpeth. 38 people were hurt.
The driver has been charged over the accident. A month later, a train between Glasgow and Edinburgh was derailed at Polmont after hitting a stray cow. 13 people were killed. 2 days later, an express was derailed near Newcastle upon Tyne. There were no serious injuries, and the crash was blamed on a faulty piece of track. On October the 1st, there was a derailment in the West Midlands. 30 people were hurt. 11 days later, a rush hour train hit a goods train at Wembley station in London. 3 people were killed. A report on that accident is with the Director of Public Prosecutions. British Rail said tonight that the number of deaths had to be seen in the context of the 695 million passengers they carry each year. A spokesman said, "Our safety record is second to none."
An explosion on a goods train carrying fuel has caused a huge fire in the tunnel beneath the Pennines. The train was derailed early this morning halfway through the 2-mile-long Summit tunnel near Todmorden on the line between Manchester and Leeds. No one was hurt, but when firemen tried to clear the line, the fuel exploded, and they had to run for their lives as a fireball swept down the tunnel. Richard Wells reports.
Throughout the day, flames and smoke poured from Summit Tunnel. 200 feet below the Pennines was the stricken freight train. Its ignited cargo erupting to the surface through ventilation shafts. Flames soared 200 feet high. There were 10 derailed tankers in the inferno, but it was impossible to tell how many had exploded. No one could get near. At one stage, a group of firemen did get close, but their lives were immediately in danger.
All of a sudden, the vents blew on the 7th truck. When they blew, flames came out of the vents, giving off thick, acrid smoke, which was bellowing up over the top of the tunnel, down the sides, and coming at us at a rate of knots.
They fled for their lives, and no one was injured. 200 firemen from both sides of the Pennines fought to control the blaze, but their task was impossible. People living near to the tunnel were ordered from their homes.
Sorry, look, we've got to evacuate, yeah.
Well, where do we go?
I'll take you to Walsall Junior School. That's where everybody is.
50 went to one local school, 50 to another. And though tonight some were allowed back to their cottages, most, young and old, face a night in bunk beds, hurriedly erected in the school assembly hall. The most firemen could do was to contain the blaze within the tunnel by pumping foam through one shaft that wasn't on fire. But there were other hazards. Petrol fumes increased the risk of more explosions, and a river in Rochdale 8 miles away was polluted with petrol from the tunnel. Tonight, the flames above ground were eventually drenched by torrential rain. In the tunnel, the fire rages, and it's expected to continue for the next 2 days. Only then will the true cost be known, and whether a Pennine railway service has survived.
Firemen are tonight struggling to control a chemical fire ranging 200 feet down in a railway tunnel near Todmorden in Yorkshire. At least 4 tanker wagons, each holding 45 tons of petroleum spirit, exploded after a derailment. Another 7 tankers are still in the tunnel.
The derailment happened as a diesel pushing 13 fuel wagons, each containing 70 tons of petrol, was halfway through the 2-mile Summit tunnel at one of the highest points in the Pennines. More than 100 firemen were called to the scene, but their efforts were hampered by choking black smoke and the sheer distance between the mouth of the tunnel and the train. The loco and 3 wagons were moved clear, and for a time the situation looked under control. But as firemen prepared to use foam on the blaze, the first of several explosions sent them running for cover. Within minutes, the tunnel was an inferno, and efforts to cut off the supply of air by pumping foam down the 200-foot ventilation shafts had no effect.
My feelings was to get my men out as quickly as I could, without subjecting them to any danger. And it was touch and go coming out of the tunnel. It was about 20 minutes walk into the tunnel, and it seemed that the services, coming out.
By mid-afternoon, 2 ventilation shafts were belching smoke and flame as one by one the fuel wagons exploded in the intense heat. More than 100 people living nearby were evacuated amid fears that fumes could cause further explosions. Robert Hall for ITN, Yorkshire.
Firemen have reached the tanker train that's been burning in a tunnel in the Pennines. They say foam pumped down ventilation shafts has subdued the fire, and there's no longer a risk of an explosion. Martin Henfield reports.
Smoke from one of the hillside ventilation shafts revealed the fire is still burning in the railway tunnel 200 feet below. Masonry had been cracked in the intense heat, an indication of what may have happened to the Victorian brick-lined tunnel itself. Foam is still being pumped down some of the ventilation shafts. There's now a half-mile-long blanket of foam between the 10 wrecked tankers and the mouth of the tunnel at Littleborough. For the first time, firemen were able to enter the tunnel, but they had to check for the presence of explosive gases. A map of the tunnel showed the progress of the firemen and British Rail engineers as they made their way towards the wrecked train.
We have a situation deep in a tunnel where we've got petroleum spirit and a fire and possibly some explosive vapour, some flammable vapour. It is just possible that the fire might develop quite rapidly. Consequently, we are making very slow and careful progress to try and avoid any worsening of the situation.
People who had to spend the night in makeshift accommodation are expected to be able to return home tonight. They'd been put up in a number of old people's homes. Streams in the area have now been checked for petrol, which had seeped from the tankers. Traces were found several miles away. But making the wreck safe and clearing the track is likely to be a long job. Tonight, the emergency services were having to proceed with extreme caution.
Firemen have now brought under control the underground blaze in the railway tunnel in the Pennines near Manchester. The fire broke out when an oil tanker train pulled by a locomotive caught fire yesterday. Firemen have pumped thousands of gallons of foam into the tunnel. Rail services will be disrupted for weeks on the line because of wreckage and damage to the tunnel structure. Families evacuated last night are now being allowed to go home.
4 railway workers were killed when a train hit a group of men clearing snow from the track. 2 others were treated in hospital for shock. A third escaped injury. The accident happened at Magor in Gwent, about half a mile from the Severn Tunnel. A train from Cardiff ran into the track maintenance team shortly after midnight. Elvin Thomas reports.
The men were clearing snow from the main line just before 1 o'clock this morning when they were struck by a train carrying British Rail staff, which was travelling from Cardiff to the Severn Tunnel Junction station. 4 men, 3 of them from Gwent and 1 from Cardiff, died instantly. 2 others were taken to hospital in Newport suffering from shock, but have since been allowed to go home. British Rail have launched their own investigation into the accident to find out what went wrong, with their detailed regulations aimed at ensuring the safety of railmen working on the track.
Express as it moves slowly through Battersea Park Station. The fact that both trains were moving, albeit at different speeds, accounted for the limited amount of damage. Both trains were non-stopping. The Express from Gatwick, part of a new high-speed service begun a year ago, was packed with visitors and holidaymakers, many of them still clearly dazed.
Everyone was thrown forward. I was thrown forward, and it wasn't too nice.
You seem all right?
Yeah, I passed out after I hit a man on the head, my forehead.
What about the other passengers around you?
They were screaming and yelling and didn't know what was going on, you know. I thought the train derailed.
Ambulance officials said 70 passengers had been taken to hospital, about a dozen of them seriously hurt, mostly suffering from whiplash injuries. Among the last to be brought out was the driver of the Express. The man was taken out by way of one of the carriages because the doors of his cab were jammed. But he too had survived what would have been a more disastrous collision had the leading train been stationary. BR officials at Battersea began an immediate inquiry into the cause of the accident.
About 40 people were taken to hospital after a collision between 2 trains on the main line from Glasgow to Ayr just outside Paisley. The crash happened when a passenger train ran into the back of a stationary goods train. The driver of the passenger train had to be cut free from the wreckage and he's seriously ill. Signals on the stretch of line where the crash happened are being renewed and British Rail have begun an inquiry. Transport Secretary says the passenger train in last night's head-on crash in Derbyshire had been given the go-ahead to pass a red stop signal. Mr. Nicholas Wrigley said the public inquiry will be held into the accident which killed the engine driver and injured 25 passengers.
Rescue workers who reached the scene soon after the head-on collision feared a major disaster, but only 1 man died, the passenger train's driver. It took firemen 2 hours to free his body from the wreckage of his cab. 28 passengers were helped off for hospital treatment, largely for bruises and concussion, but most continued their journey on a relief train.
I wasn't really aware at all. I was reading a book, and then all I can remember is this almighty crash, and then everything was on top of us.
Everybody was very calm, and some people got up to help people. There was a couple of people injured, so they were helped, but everybody was very calm.
Railway investigators on the scene this morning quickly established the passenger train had been travelling on the wrong track. It stopped at a red danger signal, but was then told to go through the light. Why that authorisation was given and by whom will now be the subject of a public inquiry. Kevin.
6 people die as a train and a van crash at a level crossing on Humberside. It's feared other bodies are still trapped under the wreckage. 36 passengers have been injured, 10 of them seriously. The 9:33 Bridlington to Hull train was packed with holidaymakers returning home when it struck the van on an unmanned crossing at Lockington.
The crash, the worst rail accident in Britain for 2 years, happened this morning at the level crossing at Lockington near Beverley. The 9:33 Bridlington to Hull train was packed with holidaymakers when it rammed into a vehicle that was on the unmanned crossing. The van, which had 2 people inside, was torn to pieces on impact. The 4 carriages of the train were derailed. One of them spun round completely. Firemen say some passengers were trapped. Some were underneath the carriage. More than 50 firemen were called to the scene. They used heat-seeking cameras to help search for survivors. 2 firemen were injured as they helped free people from the wreckage. One of the firemen is still being detained in hospital.
There would be dozens of people moving about in a dazed and shocked condition. There were people laid on the side being tended by fit passengers, and indeed a further complication, a train that was stopped further up the line was full of people that were deeply concerned, and we had to reassure them to keep them in the train.
As the emergency operation continues, it's feared that the death toll could grow. Firemen say it's possible that 1 or more passengers were crushed beneath a carriage that's still on its side. Firemen are now working to lift the carriage. More than a dozen ambulances ferried the injured to Hull Royal Infirmary. Hospital staff say it's the worst disaster they've ever had to cope with. They've been inundated with calls from worried relatives. British Rail investigators have already started their inquiry. At some stage, they're hoping to interview the driver of the train and the driver of the van, although both men are seriously ill. The accident has shocked local residents who say they're not happy that the warning lights on the unmanned crossing were actually working. But British Rail say they believe that the automated crossing was working properly, as it was checked only a few days ago.
And there's
2 intercity express trains collided in Staffordshire tonight. 2 people are dead, more than 30 are hurt, at least 15 are believed seriously injured. Both trains were packed with people going away for the weekend. British Rail say they would have been travelling at speed. The crash happened at Colwich Junction between Stafford and Rugeley. The 2 trains were the 5 o'clock from London Euston to Manchester and the 5:20 from Liverpool to Euston. They crashed at a point where the Manchester train would have crossed the southbound line on its way north.
The accident happened just after 6:30. 2 express trains were crowded with people returning home for the weekend. Eyewitnesses say one hit the other at full speed at a point where the main north-south lines cross. One witness said 10 carriages shot more than 30 feet into the air. Emergency services were at the scene within minutes, and casualties were carried into fields next to the line. Medical teams treated the injured where they lay. Ambulance men pulled 2 dead bodies from the wreckage. In the past 2 hours, 70 people have been taken to the nearby Stafford District General Hospital. 36 are said to have serious injuries.
You can see in front of you the holocaust that's been caused, the number of coaches that are off the rails. Why the accident actually happened, of course, I'm not in charge of all those facts. That would be the railway authority.
You've described it as a holocaust, but yes. Isn't it a miracle in some ways that no more people have been injured?
Yes, it's an absolute miracle. In view of the fact that there were 2 packed trains at peak time travelling along the line, and accidents have occurred as you see, then I think it is a miracle. Without a doubt, that's the best word for it.
How difficult has it been to empty these packed trains and get people away?
It wasn't very difficult at all, because almost immediately the people started getting off the trains. There wasn't a tremendous amount of panic. The casualties were in fact helped off the trains by the ambulance service and those sort of people.
and also from local people who came to help and police officers. They were very quickly taken off the train and then by a fleet of ambulances to the Stafford District Hospital.
British Rail say the two trains would have been travelling very fast at up to 100 miles an hour on what is the fastest line between London and the northwest. The possibility of signal fault is now being investigated.
And
6:30 this evening. The two express trains were crammed with people returning home for the weekend. They collided at full speed, and one witness said carriages shot 30 feet into the air. Emergency services were on the scene within minutes, and the casualties carried into nearby fields. Medical staff treated the injured where they lay. It's thought 15 people are seriously hurt and 2 dead. One of them, the driver of the Liverpool to London train.
You can see in front of you the holocaust that's been caused, the number of coaches that are off the rails.
They'll hold an inquiry on Tuesday into the crash near Stafford between 2 intercity expresses. It's the 7th major rail accident this year. A train travelling from Liverpool to Euston hit a train from Euston to Manchester, which was apparently turning across Colwich Junction. One person, the driver of one train, was killed. The other driver leapt from his cab before the accident. 32 people are still in hospital, 2 seriously injured. This report from Colin Philpott, one of the 800 passengers in the accident.
Firemen with cutting gear worked through the night to remove the body of the driver from the crushed cab of the southbound train. At that stage, it still wasn't clear whether everyone on the 2 trains had been accounted for, and the search continued through the tangled wreckage. Meanwhile, survivors who'd been comforted in a nearby churchyard were taken by coaches to continue their journeys. This morning, daylight revealed the full horror of the accident, including the remains of the northbound locomotive. It's now known that the driver jumped clear moments before the impact, and British Rail is investigating reports that a second person, possibly another railway employee, was travelling in the cab. Exactly what happened still isn't clear, but railway officials now say they think that the northbound train may have been across the junction when the train from Liverpool ran into it, causing the engine where the driver died to jackknife 180 degrees. 2 300-ton cranes were brought in this morning to lift the wreckage into a neighbouring field, but it could be Wednesday before the line is clear. British Rail's own formal inquiry into the cause of the accident will take place on Tuesday. British Rail estimates that at least 800 people were travelling on these 2 busy Friday night expresses. The trains were travelling at speed. It's thought that one of them was going at around 100 miles an hour. In those circumstances, everyone here thinks it's remarkable that so many of us walked away from this crash, shaken but otherwise unhurt.
Good evening. In Staffordshire tonight, police are appealing for anyone who is a passenger on either of the 2 express trains that crashed on Friday to get in touch with them. As many as 400 passengers could have got out of the wreckage unhurt and made their own way home. Police think some of them may have information that could help explain why the crash happened. This report from Len Tingle.
Today, this is all that remains of the 1720 Intercity Express out of Liverpool and the 1600 out of Euston after their mystery collision in the Midlands. And that's after 4 days of work by British Rail engineers to clear the line. The full extent of that Friday night crash only became clear from the air at dawn on Saturday. No one knows why, but the packed northbound intercity overshot the junction at Colwich near Stafford. It came to rest in the path of the 100-mile-an-hour southbound express. The driver of the stationary train jumped out to plant detonators on the track to warn the oncoming locomotive. It was too late. The train, carriages and 800 passengers were on a collision course which nothing could halt. Fire brigade rescuers who took these video pictures when they turned up just minutes later were astonished to find that there was only 1 dead and 70 injured. They expected many more.
One of the major headaches of the engineers trying to clear the track is the sheer strength of the carriages. They've had to cut their way through 2 of them, which were so badly damaged that they couldn't be lifted away. But it's that same strength for which those now injured and recovering at Stafford District General Hospital know that they owe their lives.
Survivors like Liverpool doctor James Willis flung the length of the dining car, crushing his ribs.
Well, I think I'm right in saying that British Rail have all steel coaches. And if you consider that in that train there were, some 800 passengers, you imagine an equivalent accident involving 800 people in motor cars on a motorway. I think you'd have far more people killed.
Engineer Paul Holden from Stafford had only joined the train 5 minutes before.
Amazement, really. The part of the end of a coach was lying in the field next to me where I was sat, and it was quite considerable thickness of steel, just lying there ripped off.
Altogether, 11 people are still in hospital. 1 is described as critical. Meanwhile, police are attempting to trace up to 400 passengers who left the scene on the night and may have valuable evidence to solve the mystery of the crash.
But there are some, we feel, possibly running into quite a large number who may not have done and who may have left the scene under their own steam or by telephoning or contacting relatives whom we really would like to come forward and for us to be able to interview them.
So, as police concentrate on trying to trace passengers, British Rail is setting up its own inquiry. At the scene of the crash, work goes on round the clock to clear and relay the tracks. Trains should be running normally through Colwich by Wednesday, but by tomorrow British Rail will have started its own inquiry into the disaster. This will be held at rail headquarters in Crewe. The questions the investigators will want answered are: why had the Manchester train stopped right on the Colwich junction where 2 lines cross? Had there been a signal failure? The driver of the Manchester train tried to stop the approaching Liverpool Express. Why didn't he just move his own train back? A red signal should stop a locomotive automatically. If there was mechanical failure, was it on the locomotive or on the signalling equipment? Part of the answer could lie here at Colwich signal box. Trains have no equivalent to an aeroplane's black box, but a logging device in the signal box will show whether or not there was a failure in any part of the 20-year-old signalling apparatus. Well, in a few days, the Minister of Transport is expected to announce a date for a public inquiry. But already, rail experts are praising the strength and the design of the latest British Rail carriages, which they say saved many lives. Today in Derby, British Rail engineers have been explaining just how.
This stage-managed crash in Leicestershire 2 years ago was designed to show the levels of impact a container for nuclear waste could withstand. But the collision at 100 miles an hour also demonstrates how one of the safety features built into the coaches involved in Friday's accident actually work. It's the Buckeye coupling used for linking the carriages together. It replaces the old chain and hook method used before. In a crash, the Buckeye helps to keep the coaches upright and in a straight line, and thus saves lives. In the nuclear crash, the coaches used were the old Mark 1s. Those kind of carriages still used by British Rail do not have the type of rigid structure that protects the top half containing the passengers built into the Mark 3 coaches involved in Friday's accident. It was this design which has been held responsible for keeping the casualty figures so low.
It's the body side structure itself which is really the key to preventing the passenger saloon being either penetrated in a collision or totally deforming in a collision. What we have are continuous longitudinal rails and continuous vertical pillars and a particularly strong, stiff type of joint which, when plated in with the body skin, gives overall an exceedingly strong impact-resistant structure.
In addition, the coaches are given extra strength at either end, and so have the sort of rigidity a steel tube has.
Well, I think everyone concerned with the design and manufacture of Mark III coaches has every reason to feel that we've produced a good product. Doesn't mean to say that we stop there. Coaches will eventually come in for repair. That's the time to have a good look at them and see if there were any minor defects. And I say minor because in general the integrity of the coach saloon seems to have been exceedingly good.
The damaged carriages will come back to Derby for examination and rebuilding once the crash investigators have finished their inquiries.
The rebel rescue operation. This morning, after a weekend of round-the-clock working, the task of restoring the track and power lines and removing the wreckage was still underway. The derailed carriages are being lifted onto low loaders in the field where they came to rest, the weight of the lorries supported by a prefabricated metal road. This same field resembled a battleground on Friday night. but a battleground where horror had given way to calm and an impressively efficient rescue operation.
Everybody was wonderfully calm. I mean, there was no sort of panic, and people were very good to each other. It was very impressive.
So I got out, went down to see if we could help anyone, and then we started helping people out the carriage.
Local people came with blankets, and the emergency services were here within minutes. And so the rescue was very prompt indeed.
The driver of the southbound train had died, 73 people were in need of hospital treatment, dozens more were shocked and shaken, but showing remarkable courage. Fleets of ambulances ferried the injured to hospital. Most went the few miles to Stafford District General. Last year, the source of the outbreak of Legionnaire's disease. This weekend, the scene of a model example of coping with a major emergency.
We have coped with everything that's come in so far, and as far as we know, all the injured are now in the hospital.
We've called staff in from home, and in fact I would pay tribute to my staff. Many of them saw it through the media, and they rang in and came in.
It transpired that doctors and nurses had been among the injured.
There were quite a few doctors on the train because there'd been a convention of anaesthetists apparently at Manchester, and they were on.
Today, 14 people were still in hospital, 1 critically ill, 2 serious, including the Nicaraguan ambassador Francisco Diascoto. Incredibly few serious injuries, considering the devastation. Among the first rescuers had been mechanics from the fair driving station garage next to the rail line.
Anybody would have done the same.
Anybody would. It was a natural instinct when something like that happens. You do everything you can to your own ability, and what we did was just a natural instinct, as Steve says. We expected actually to see at least sort of 40 or 50 dead, not being morbid, but that's what we expected.
So much help came from local people that police still haven't traced all the passengers or all the helpers.
There were acts of heroism carried out by people in the village here who came down here when the crash first occurred and took people out and got them away out of danger, and we need to see them. And many of them brought equipment down, such as blankets, to wrap people up that went to the hospital, and they may want compensation of some sort for that equipment.
A British Rail inquiry opens tomorrow in Crewe. After it has reached its findings, the question of any criminal liability will be determined. The line itself should be open on Wednesday.
As we said, the question now being asked is how and why the accident happened. The line is one of the busiest in the country, but is controlled by the most modern technology. Grant Mansfield has been looking at the countdown to the crash.
5 o'clock on Friday afternoon, and the London to Manchester intercity service leaves on time. The journey is scheduled to take 2 hours and 38 minutes. The train will be travelling at speeds of up to 100 miles an hour. About 400 people crowd onto the 11 coaches. The driver, Brian Shaw, has more than 20 years of experience and knows the route well. He's taken a 19-year-old trainee along to see how it's done. 210 miles away, the Liverpool to London service is leaving platform 8. It's now 5:20. Again, the train is crowded. Again, it's pulling 11 coaches. Again, an experienced driver, 56-year-old Eric Good, is at the controls. The countdown to the Colwich crash has begun. By 6:30, the northbound train is approaching the Colwich junction. It's several minutes late, and now just 2 minutes away from disaster. What actually happens during those 2 minutes is yet to be officially established, but already a signal failure appears unlikely. That being the case, the driver of the London-Manchester train would have passed through a double yellow warning light, followed by a single yellow signal, and finally, just 200 yards from the junction, a red light. On each occasion, an automatic brake would have been applied. On each occasion, the driver had the option of overriding it. He may have decided that a manual application of the brakes would have slowed the train down less violently. In any event, he ran out of track and slid across the path of the southbound train, jumping clear with his young colleague moments before the crash. The Liverpool Express was approaching the junction at 100 miles an hour. Its driver had no time to escape, as it ploughed into the side of the other locomotive, by now probably stationary. Eric Good died instantly in the explosive impact, which was heard half a mile away. 73 people were injured, and some of the derailed coaches were pushed 30 feet into the air. Tomorrow, British Rail will hold an internal inquiry. That inquiry must establish whether the failure was human or mechanical. However, BR have already said that the Colwich junction is one of the most modern and sophisticated in the country, with numerous fail-safe devices. The key question then is likely to be, why did the northbound train fail to stop before the junction? Only two men can provide the answer, the driver and his 19-year-old trainee. They will be the key witnesses when the inquiry opens in Crewe tomorrow morning.
It's amazing that in a crash which sent coaches hurtling into the air, there were not more deaths and serious injuries. One of the reasons for this is the much stronger and safer coaches now used on our railways. These were developed following the horrific train crash at Harrow 34 years ago. Then the coaches disintegrated, giving no protection to the passengers. Of the 1,000 people on board, 112 were killed and nearly 200 injured.
The design and manufacture of railway carriages has come a long way since 1952, and it's that progress which played a large part in saving lives in Friday's horrific accident. This is the shell of a Mark III coach, the latest of its type to be designed and built here at British Rail Engineering in Derby. It's been in production for 10 years, and it's specifically designed to ensure that if the coach is involved in a high-speed accident, the inner frame will absorb the impact, stay intact, and so protect the passengers inside.
The passenger saloon area is neither crumpled up, killing passengers in that way, or it's not torn open, throwing passengers out onto the track.
So the coach remains as an integral frame?
So the coach remains as an integral box. Dented and deformed maybe in parts, glass broken perhaps, but in essentials it stays as a total box and the passengers are thereby protected.
It's a rounded design similar in many ways to an aircraft fuselage. It's tested to exacting international standards, and engineers here at Derby believe it's a design which has taken safety technology to just about its limit.
In terms of structural safety, my own opinion is that we can't go a great deal further at this time. There may be lessons to be learned from collisions, and if there are, then certainly looking at coaches after collisions, we will pick up the problems, redesign and incorporate them in future designs. But I think these would be quite minor at the present time.
There are no immediate lessons to be learned from the crash at Staffordshire over the weekend?
Perhaps not until we've had a look at the actual vehicles as they return to repair.
BREL's latest coach design is the International, which should come into service next month, ironically on the Manchester to Euston line. Its makers are hoping that if it too should ever be involved in an accident, it'll prove just as safe as its predecessor.
Taken to hospital in Slough, 5 are said to be seriously hurt. The train was full of children on their way to school. Julian O'Halloran reached the scene soon after the crash.
The crash happened just before 8:30 this morning. The train from Marylebone in London, with about 180 people on board, hit the back of an empty train which had halted half a mile before Sear Green station. The front carriage of the moving train embedded itself in the back of the other. Rescuers worked for 3 hours with cutting equipment to free the dead and injured.
Can you contact ambulance control? Apparently there's an ambulance on its way with some drip sets. Can you find out how far it is and when it's likely to get here? Because they're required urgently because there's just been one more live casualty apparently.
Ambulance men, local doctors and fire service vehicles had to battle along roads made almost impassable by snow and then clamber down a steep embankment to get to the crash scene. The driver of the moving train was among those killed, but several more dead and injured were still trapped. A service train from Sear Green station brought more rescue equipment to the spot. The moving train had been half full, and a number of those on board were children on their way to school. By midday, the rescue was almost complete. Throughout the operation, local doctors had played a vital part in tending the injured.
Well, I just first aided.
I see. 5 people were seriously injured and 5 more received minor injuries. Because of appalling road conditions, ambulances were taking far longer than usual to get the injured to hospital. 3.5 hours after the crash, the service train was back in Sear Green station. Rescue workers then had the tragic task of removing the last 2 bodies to have been retrieved. They were those of 2 schoolboys, according to police, aged about 14. The injured were taken to Wexham Park Hospital in Slough. There, Mike Mackay spoke to a survivor trapped at the front of the moving train, Norman Wilkes. He had a broken foot and cuts.
There were 3 children sitting in opposite me, on the other side I should say, and they were obviously in agony as well. You know, they caught the impact as well.
You say they were in agony. Did you hear them?
Well, I heard them crying out after I collapsed, you know.
So how many people were in that carriage, would you say?
I wouldn't have said there was more than about 8 or 9.
Now British Rail have the task of finding out why it happened. It's known that the driver of the train which halted got out to report an obstruction on the line. And a fallen tree was clearly visible just ahead of that train. Weighed down by snow, it had fallen across the line. And heavy branches were still falling onto the wrecked trains as the rescuers worked. British Rail begin an internal inquiry tomorrow, and they'll try to discover whether a signal failure took place as well.